Hi, and welcome back. We are now on the prologue part of the Saints of Snowville. We're going to do these as like a chapter. We'll do one a day so that you can hear the whole entire story. Let's get started. In the 1920s, Snowville, Idaho was a typical farming community in the middle of Mormon country. The town itself was situated near Bear Lake at the foot of the rugged mountains which divide the Bear River Basin from the Great Salt Lake Basin of northern Utah. The nearby town of Paris had a population of 1,200 and was county seat, state headquarters, and trading center. A few miles away was the Utah border, and Snowville had served in years gone by as refuge for fugitive polygamists. In the early 1920s, most of the conveniences usually associated with modern living had not yet been extended to southeastern Idaho communities or to Snowville. Electric lights were still 14 years away. In the second term of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Rural Electric Administration brought electric lights to the small towns along Bear Lake. The most common means of illumination prior to this time was a kerosene lamp that could be carried in the house from room to room. There were 3 or 4 automobiles in the village, but they could not be used from November to May because of snow and mud. The sleigh in winter and wagons or horseback at other times were the conventional means of transportation. An inside toilet was something viewed only in the Sears Roebuck catalog. A 2-hole privy 20 yards back of the house was an essential adjunct to every household. Only the church and school enjoyed the luxury of a 3-hole deluxe privy. During the spring and early summer, water from the melting snow flowed in every direction, but in the 5 months each year when snow was as much as 4 feet deep on the ground was frozen, obtaining water was a very real problem. Sometimes in January and February it was 40 or 50 degrees below zero. The most reliable year-round source of water was the open well. Water was drawn from the wells by a bucketful with an aid of a rope and pulley. Some people had a hand pump, which was some improvement, but there was always the risk of freezing or malfunction. A few had the use of an amateur-engineered pipeline instead of a hydrant for the outlet. The local blacksmith fashioned a 3/4-inch pipe into a gooseneck that could be turned on or off. This pipeline couldn't be relied upon, however, in the winter. It was usually frozen solid in the summer, and airlock or low pressure gently impaired its usefulness. Consider the prodigious task of drawing or pumping water for domestic use, and also for a herd of milk cows and several horses. The other alternative was to drive the livestock to Snowville Creek, a mile away, twice a day, and bring the domestic supply back in milk cans. In order to get to the water in the creek, it was necessary to cut through 2 feet of ice. It was not uncommon for livestock to perish after falling through the ice into an open water hole. In Snowville, there were 1 brick house, a number of frame houses, and a few log houses. The log houses had mud or clay for chinking between the logs. Some of the log houses still had dirt or sod roofs. None of the houses had central heating. This combined dining room and living room was heated by a wood-burning heater. The kitchen was heated by the kitchen range. The bedrooms were unheated. Getting into bed in the winter was something like the first jump in the swimming hole. Once you got in, it wasn't too bad. Frequently, the sting of the cold bed was reduced by placing stones or flat irons or even old Sears Roebuck catalog in bed about 30 minutes before bedtime. The stones, flat irons, or catalog had previously been heated in the oven and would hold their heat for about 2 hours. If 2 or more persons were sleeping in the bed, the sleeping conditions were greatly improved. A certain amount of animal heat was generated which tended to warm the entire bed. If 3 or more people slept in a bed, the middle sleeping position was the position of honor. Frequently, families moved 1 or more beds into the living room during the coldest part of the winter and sealed off the bedrooms. Overnight company in the winter always presented a sleeping problem. In the summer, any number of beds could be made on the floor or in the hayloft, but in the winter, because of the cold and limited quilts, the number of beds had to be reduced. Children of either sex up to 10 years could be thrown 4 or 5 in a bed. If a married couple was visiting, the 2 women could sleep in the middle and the 2 men on the outside by their respective wives. If an adult sister was visiting, the lady of the house slept in the middle, the sister on the one side and the husband in the other. The same arrangement was proper for the mother-in-law. The same treatment was not accorded to a visiting brother or father-in-law, however. He either got in bed with several boys or slept on the floor, cold or no cold. The sexes could not be mixed with teenagers under any conditions. Hauling trees out of the hills and chopping or sawing the logs into stove-length size in the bitter winter was no small task. Chilblains and frostbite were commonplace. The living conditions prevailing in Snowville were not considered by the natives to be hardship conditions, nor were they uncommon in the general area. It was the way of life into which they were born, and few knew or envied any other. The schoolhouse was in two parts. One, an old red brick structure, was for the upper grades. The other, a small frame building, housed the first and second grades. In this frame structure, a wood-burning pot-bellied stove in the front and center of the room supplied the heat. In extreme weather, the temperature near the stove might be as high as 90 degrees, while near the rear of the building it would be near freezing. The building was not insulated, so most of the heat went through the ceiling and melted the snow on the roof, while considerable cold air came under the door and along the floor. In the winter, the students' feet were always cold. The classes performed certain physical exercises several times a day to help warm the lower extremities. The building contained no lights, nor were they necessary, because no school activities were held at night. In the school, there were a number of students several years behind their age group. Because of the distance from the school or work on the farm, a number of the boys and a few of the girls stayed out of school a few years, or were starting late. The Snowville ward of the Bear Lake Stake Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was composed of about 400 churchgoers and some hundred Jack Mormons who lived in near the Snowville community. The ward met in a large one-room wooden church, which served as a chapel and classroom every Sunday, a theater and dance hall on Saturday night, and a basketball floor almost every other night of the week. The church house was the cultural, entertainment, and athletic center of the community. The building entered by way of a small foyer beneath the ancient steeple and belfry, which housed a large brass bell and hundreds of sparrows, was heated by two pot-bellied stoves, one at the entrance and one at the other end. The front, or opposite end of the entrance, was composed of a stage, where Sunday school classes were held. Actors played during plays, and spectators sat during basketball games and dances. The unpolished wooden floor, decorated with obvious foul lines, boundaries, center jump circle, and the like for the basketball games, was filled with movable wooden benches during Sunday meetings. For Sunday school, the room was divided down the middle by a long curtain held up by a rope, which each side was divided 3 more times, forming 6 classrooms for Sunday school classes. A movable pulpit was placed under the basketball hoop at the front end, and a long bench was placed back of the pulpit for speakers and those officiating. This arrangement served during sacrament meetings. The bishop had an ostra room that served as an office on one side of the stage. This room doubled as a storage room for scenery, the pulpit when not in use, brooms, and other janitorial supplies. 95% of the townspeople were Mormons, children of Scandinavian and English-Scottish immigrants, and could read and write. A few Mormons had attended Brigham Young College, a high school, in Logan, 50 miles away, and a 2-day trip through Logan Canyon. Others had attended Fielding Academy at Paris, a church-related school. Non-Mormons of the area were called Gentiles. Utah and environs was the only place in the world where a Jew was referred to as a Gentile. The Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was the rule of life in Snowville, and anyone not living the religion was a sinner in the eyes of the saints of Snowville. The church prohibited the use of tobacco, tea, coffee, alcohol, and strong drinks as set forth in the Word of Wisdom. Good church men and women were admonished to lead a clean life and not associate with people who might lead them astray. As in all Mormon communities, even small children were well versed in the Bible, as well as in the Book of Mormon and other religious writings followed by the Mormons. Young men, once they reached the right age, were often called on missions to preach the gospel of the Mormon Church all over the world. Young couples, if they were worthy, were married in one of the Mormon temples, the closest being in Logan. Life in Snowville was good, but so isolated from the world that citizens usually took narrow and fanatical views when problems arose. Jonathan Golden Kimball was one of the most famous men produced in Bear Lake Valley. He served as one of the general authorities of the church for more than 40 years. President Kimball left a legacy of profanity and straight talk in the valley. High society folks and the brethren in Salt Lake City were shocked by naughty words like damn and hell. Jay Golden didn't even consider this swearing. Neither did the saints of Bear Lake. It was part of the language. Brother Kimball would be quoted and emulated in the Bear Lake stake for 100 years. He settled on a homestead near Laketown, Utah in 1876 and sold out in the early 1890s. When he came to Bear Lake, he didn't have a window to throw it out. He didn't have a window to throw it out of, and was acquainted with sorrow and extreme poverty. He left another gift to his dear friends, a legacy of honesty, truthfulness, integrity, and love. He was a giant among the saints, and the most beloved man in the church. The job of the bishop in a Mormon ward was to minister to the spiritual needs of members of a church, in effect, acting as the father of the congregation to settle land and water disputes, marital problems, and family squabbles, to conduct funerals and weddings, and to administer to the sick and injured, and those who had strayed from the teaching of the church. Mormon doctrine had made provision for the bishop's court. The avowed purpose of this court was to try members for violation of the moral code and for apostasy. For many years, the Mormons had a distaste and distrust for state civil courts of law and tried to settle their own problems in bishops' courts. Hence, church trials were had in land and water disputes, domestic problems, and also competition with church-owned businesses, slander of church leaders, and a variety of other matters. A bishop was not paid for his services, and in the time not devoted to church work. Often the early hours of morning and late hours of night he looked after his own farm and businesses, and his own family affairs. Life for a bishop was demanding, not only for the man called for the job, but for his family as well. Yet some bishops served as many as 30 years in their offices, leaving it only by dying or being elevated to higher office or because of poor health. The bishop was selected by the stake president and approved by the first presidency of the church, sitting in Salt Lake City. Bear Lake Stake was composed of 9 wards, including the Snowville ward, and was governed by a stake president, his counselors, and the High Council. The president usually had served as a ward bishop, and his duties included supervising ward bishops and coordinating activities among the wards. Although his area was larger, the stake president's job was not as personally demanding as a bishop's. At least, that is the way it started out in the early days of the church. A bishop had great power and authority. As time went on, his authority was eroded away, and the stake president grew more powerful and entered into the day-to-day regulation of the wards. The gradual centralization of power in the stake president was a source of irritation to the ward bishop, and he did not surrender his power, originally contemplated, willingly. And next time we will start with Chapter 1 of the Saints of Snowville. Hope you're enjoying this. Have a great evening.